Stoughton Media Access Corporation is pleased to present International Forum, a new cable show of interest, periodically interviewing foreign newsmakers, bringing them from across the ocean directly to your living room. Here's your host for this week's show, Steve Kelly.
Hi. Today in International Forum, I have the pleasure of introducing you to Diana West. And Diana West is a syndicated columnist, and she has written a couple of books that are absolutely interesting, and not for the simple mind, I might add. One of her books, American Betrayal, The Secret Assault on Our Nation's Character, and a prior book, The Death of the Grown-Up, which really interests me, The Death of the Grown-Up, and with a subtitle of How America's Arrested Development is Bringing Down Western Civilization. So welcome, Diana, to the show.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be with you.
Okay. So Diana, this is the kind of reading that about history that you're talking about. And if I could just set the stage a little bit, Diana's work is focused, the latest book is focused on the Soviet Union's influence in American work pre the Second World War, 1930s and into 1940s, and also the McCarthy era. So how would you like to share a little bit just to give the audience a taste of what your book is about and what they need to know?
Well, it might be interesting to share with the audience that I started to write this book, a different book. I actually was writing a book about much more contemporary matters. I'm a journalist. I write a weekly column, and ever since 9/11, I've been very focused on our experience with Islam, the impact of Islam on the Western mind. In many ways, that's what The Death of the Grown-Up actually works up to, because I found that the cultural arc of emphasis on youth put us in a position where I believe we're very susceptible to the more authoritarian dictates of Sharia law under Islam. And so it kind of explains this cultural arc, mixing culture with matters of concern after 9/11. I thought I would be continuing, in a sense, to mine this territory because I still didn't feel like I had the answers. For example, if you think about it, 9/11, which we're coming up on another somber anniversary, 9/11 happens. President Bush tells us Islam is a religion of peace. And then for the next decade plus, we are actually looking at a situation where any statement, if you are a public person, if you are writing in the public square, or if you are a politician trying to deal with matters in the public square, all statements need to support this completely illogical statement. It is not a logical statement to say Islam is a religion of peace. We look around the world, we see Islam not being a religion of peace, with many exploding situations, many territories exploding, conquest, histories of conquest, centuries of repression, a very dictatorial law, and so on. It can be many things, but a religion of peace, is that really logical? So I thought for my new book that I wanted to look at how it could be that we could amass these facts, for example, the history of Islam across the continents, across cultures, and so on, the law of Islam, the culture of Islam, and yet our public voice on Islam is always, well, it's a religion of peace. So I wanted to see, was there precedent in our past for this kind of turning a blind eye to an ideological threat to our system, to system of liberty based on the Constitution? And this took me back in time. It took me much farther than I thought. I never thought I would suddenly find myself seeing alarming parallels with our experience with communism. And this was something, it was actually a revelation to me. My research was such a revelation to me that the book is actually written in first person. It's an unusual history book because it is my experience with history, really. But what I tried to do was show the striking parallels between, for example, the federal government whitewashing Islam after 9/11 and the federal government whitewashing communism during World War II. I mean, this interested me because I had no idea that this was the case. Took me back even farther than that. Where did that come from? And so that was what led me into the 1930s, to look at the Roosevelt administration anew, to take all the new knowledge we have after the fall of the Soviet Union, which is when we got a little look at some of the KGB archives, a partial look, but a look, and finding out about a small army of hundreds of American traitors actually working for Stalin from the 1930s on into the 1940s, looking at their impact on the policymaking chain in America.
Right.
This is what I set up to do, and comparing that to our modern time.
Okay. Well, first of all, I want to point out that this is the book, American Betrayal. So I don't know if you can see it, but there we go. Let me bring it up. So it's a really interesting writing. What would you say, like, to someone, you characterized a whitewashing of communism and a whitewashing moving forward of Islam. A couple of things I want to pick up on.
Yeah.
One would be in highlighting Islam, there are other religions too. Would you say that none of those have had any sort of a warring past? I mean, it seems that that focus would be, we don't want that to be singular. So I don't think I would want it to single out one religion without saying, like, are there other religions as well?
Well, I haven't noticed any of them ideologically inspiring war against our country in the last decade. So I focused on the threat at hand, not so much looking into centuries ago or even millennia ago. It's not a religious book.
Okay.
What I'm looking at, I cover the war, I cover Iraq, I cover Afghanistan, I cover Washington.
Okay.
So what I am actually looking at is the government's reaction to Islamic Jihad.
Okay.
Plain and simple. And what I look at, for example, is what we have since the Bush administration. It's not a phenomenon under President Obama, it's continued, but a official effort to eliminate discussion of Islamic Jihad in the government. And this began under President Bush. He actually, under his administration, you had a lexicon, a suggested lexicon that eliminated words like jihad, words like caliphate, words like Islamic jihadism, all manner of words related to that. Suddenly, how can you discuss the phenomenon at hand? What I found in our past was a very similar kind of movement to present Stalin, of course the leader of the Soviet Union, as Uncle Joe. Communism was just like democracy. It was compatible with democracy. Even more striking similarity, for example, in 1943, you had the Soviet ambassador coming to the State Department with a list of American officials that the Soviet Union believed were anti-communist. And he asked them to be purged, and they were. They were sent all over the world, anywhere but on the Soviet desk, or actually at the time the East European desk, and so on. So this was an impact on our policymaking chain that I'm talking about. If you flash forward to 2011, you had, in the fall of 2011, you had a letter signed by 57 Islamic American groups, including several identified by the U.S. government to be Muslim Brotherhood front groups, such as ISNA, the Islamic Society of North America, CARE, Council of American Islamic Relations, signing on asking John Brennan, who was then President Obama's counterterrorism advisor, to get rid of anti-Islamic, in their view, trainers who were still functioning inside our security agencies, such as Department of Homeland Security, FBI, Justice Department, and so on, and to get rid of training materials they also deemed to be anti-Islamic. This was so done. I found the parallel quite striking. There was a feeling among officials in the 1940s that to be anti-Soviet, anti-communist, to be fearful of communists, because I think in many ways these were communist realists, was a career ender. Well, we have that in spades today. We have various people attached to intelligence who have actually been dropped from, for example, briefing the Joint Chiefs and so on, if they are perceived to be jihad realists. This is what I would characterize them. So I'm seeing these parallels and trying to understand where they come from and what they do. And so that is why the book became more about the past than the present, even though there are many parallels I draw, because I realized I was embarking on an excursion into lost history. History we're not taught.
On the subject of history, take us back to the 1934, the Wirt hearings, and tell us a little bit about those. And why is that a pivotal moment?
Yeah, that was a very interesting moment. I'm glad you mentioned that.
And even just to set the stage for the audience.
Sure.
So what are the Wirt hearings? Why should the audience know about it?
Well, this was something I never knew about. Again, I'm discovering all of this just a little bit ahead of my readers, and presenting it in almost terms of shock. I was shocked at what I found. The Wirt hearing, very interesting time. We have 1933. FDR has just become president for the first time. He's taken office in the spring of 1933. And in that fall, The New Deal is just getting off the ground, and this was the reorganization of the federal government to try to take care of the Depression.
Okay.
And the government was taking over many, many economic features, Wall Street, business, farming, and trying to run it from Washington. And there was all manner of admiration at the time for the Soviet experiment, they called it, because of course in 1933 the Soviet Union had only come into being after the 1917 revolution.
Okay.
So you're looking at a young Soviet Union, great enamorment with Marxism in America, Soviet experiment. We were in depression. People were genuinely alarmed and people were hurting. And I'm sorry?
They were interested.
They were interested in what was going on over there.
Is there a system that might avoid depression?
Right. What we ended up doing in 1933, I actually consider to be America's fall in terms of my structure for the book, because in November, just to give you a little background, November of 1933, Franklin Roosevelt recognized the Soviet Union, normalized relations. 4 presidents and 6 secretaries of state had decided not to do this before him because it was a revolutionary entity. Because the Soviet Union openly was interested in overthrowing all governments that were not Soviet, were not communist. So the previous presidents and secretaries of state didn't think this was a good diplomatic relationship. What makes this America's fall, however, is that right before this, Stalin, the leader in the Soviet Union, had just, I don't know if the word is completed, but he had just murdered some 6 million people by starvation, forcibly, by design, through government programming in the Ukraine. We know of this as the Ukraine terror famine. After that, 6 months later, America normalizes relations. I mean, can you imagine? If we just scramble history a little, imagine if 1945, some government, after 6 million Jews were killed under Nazi Germany, decided to normalize relations 6 months later. I mean, we would say that's morally unconscionable, right? Mm-hmm. And it is. But we did this in 1933. Such was the fervor for the Soviet Union in the Roosevelt administration. Well, there was more to it than that. There was a man who came to Washington to see the New Deal and to have dinner. He went to a dinner party. His name was William Wirt. And at that dinner party, which was with various members, sort of mid-level people in the New Deal, in the government, he heard a tale of revolution, very similar to the Soviet Revolution. Plans afoot to collectivize the government, to institute all manner of central control, indeed to overthrow Roosevelt. It was a very inflammatory conversation that he heard, and he was very upset by it. So he ended up writing letters to every important person in the country he could think of, and newspapers as well. He was, at the time, a noted educator. He'd been superintendent of schools in Indiana, and he had some kind of system of schooling that actually sounds rather gruesome to me. I'm sure it will to a lot of children. It was sort of an all-day platooning of work, play, sleep, eat. It doesn't sound very enticing, but he was noted for this, and it was admired for a while. I think it sort of faded away. But anyway, he had some kind of a name and interest, certainly, and stature. But he didn't get anywhere until an industrialist who was testifying in Washington, his name was James Rand, he read William Wirt's letter about this conversation into the congressional record.
Okay.
And the equivalent of a 24/7 news cycle, controversy cycle, broke out across the country, which is something in those days. They didn't have all the media, of course, that we have today.
Not the access.
Nothing.
Yeah.
No internet, obviously. But even so, not everything was a national story, of course, but this was a big story. Gradually, there became pressure and interest to have Congress look into it. Now, we had a Democratic Congress. It was the brand new New Deal. It was the Democrats were very strong at the time, and they set up a small committee to examine Dr. Wirt's claims. And what I do is I actually open the book with the day he comes to Washington in the spring of 1934 to come and testify on the Hill. Because at the same time, not the same day, but in the same season anyway, in the spring of 1934, another man came to Washington, right to Union Station, which some people I'm sure are familiar with. It's the beautiful Art Nouveau, or Beaux-Arts station rather, at the base of Capitol Hill, big white marble. They arrive at different times, but with interesting missions on the other side of each other. The other man comes with a job from his Soviet handler to come to Washington and to open up a new Soviet cell inside the State Department and other mainline government departments. Right now you had cells inside, for example, the agricultural department, but that wasn't really affecting very much. Well, it was, but they wanted more. So this man was coming. His name was Whittaker Chambers, who's still famous. We still know about Whittaker Chambers, the very famous, later to be ex-communist witness to these goings-on.
And didn't he do Alger Hiss? Is that
He
right?
later identified Alger Hiss
Yeah.
as a Soviet spy,
Right,
and there were
right.
very famous hearings, very contentious hearings. And in fact, it was sort of a civil war in America over was Whittaker Chambers telling the truth or was Alger Hiss telling the truth?
Right.
And we were not able to confirm this until, well, we were not able to reconfirm this until more recently. But Whittaker Chambers at this time was part of the communist conspiracy, and indeed the day he came to Washington, he met his first agent to expand into the State Department, and his name was Alger Hiss.
Yes.
So Whittaker Chambers arrives to meet Alger Hiss sometime that spring. Dr. Wirt, I always think of him as little Dr. Wirt, he was an older man coming to Washington to try to tell something's going on. And he goes to the Hill, and there's 3 Democrats and 2 Republicans listening. It's called the Bullwinkle Committee. And essentially, I consider it to be America's first show trial. This was not a committee set out to find the truth. This was a committee designed to shut the truth down. And we look at this committee, I've read the hearings, I quote from them in the book. Dr. Wirt was not allowed to give his statement, contrary to Senate custom. He was not allowed to have counsel, contrary to Senate custom. He was not allowed to cross-examine witnesses, again, contrary to the normal practice. He was not allowed to call witnesses, and several other things. And so sure enough, the other dinner guests come, there's 6 of them.
Yep.
They come and testify after Dr. Wirt barely is able to give much of a statement at all. And they all to a man, well, there were women there as well, but all to a person, they all say, Dr. Wirt spoke all night. We couldn't have been talking about revolution. He never shut up. And Dr. Wirt, they describe him with his fists clenched, looking at this, and he couldn't say anything. And he was essentially voted by the Congress 3-2, it was a party line vote, a liar. And they said a few years later he died of a broken heart of this.
Yeah.
Now there's a kicker to the story, which is very interesting. The story, again, was national news. You actually had President Roosevelt getting in the act and making fun of Dr. Wirt. He actually came back to Washington in the middle of the hearings and, you know, greeted the reporters at Union Station and said, well, boys, I hear things have gone from bad to Wirt around here, making a little pun.
Yeah.
And you had doggerel written, you had all, Mrs. Roosevelt, there were cartoons. I mean, it was a big story, all to smear Dr. Wirt, all to make sure he could not speak out. Later, after we get Soviet archives opened up a little bit, we find out that of the other 6 guests, 3 show up as Soviet agents and assets. So Dr. Wirt's story is not so far afield, and there's one other confirmation which is even more important. One of the 3 Democrats who was part of this kind of team to just close it down was a Democratic representative from New York named Representative John J. O'Connor. And he, after Dr. Wirt died, actually confessed in public. He wrote an article that was printed across the country that was, he called it a mea culpa. And he apologized to the dear departed Dr. Wirt for having been part of, he called it turning the screws on Dr. Wirt. And he described the collusion involved with the guests getting together and cooking up a story. And he described how the Democrats were not interested in getting the truth out because they wanted the New Deal to continue without any kind of bumps. So it was a political kangaroo court that essentially shut down Dr. Wirt with whatever he had to testify to. And the thing that's, Mr. O'Connor actually said, everything Dr. Wirt said came to pass. Right. This was interesting. But I think what it set up for me, looking at what Chambers was doing by setting up a new cell that day, and Dr. Wirt was being sort of shut down and trying to talk about matters more generally, I realized that gradually that what I was setting up was a story of the past century that was not really a struggle between the free world and communism. It was more a study between what I consider to be the forces of concealment and the forces of openness. People trying to talk out and people trying to keep things down. And I think looking at the past through with that lens, you get a very different feel for what really went on.
Let me interrupt your line
of course,
thought for a
that was
minute.
long.
that was, yeah. But, So if I'm in the audience, I'm wondering, how did this person come to this place in her life?
Me?
Yeah, you. So in other words, we all have different jobs. Some of us are firemen
Sure.
and policewomen and whatever things that we all do, right? Real estate brokers. But you're a journalist. How did that happen in your life? So kind of just bring us back to your own personal story a little bit.
Well, I've always been, I've been a journalist since I left college, almost 30 years ago, and maybe it is 30 years ago, I can't remember. And
We'll say 20.
we'll say 20
We'll say 20.
Yes, we'll
Okay.
say 20, thank
Okay.
you. But I've always been very interested in learning and finding out, and I've always been one to want to know the backstory. I've always been one leery of what an authority tells me and
Yeah.
wants me to accept sight unseen or sight untested.
Right.
And I find, having been a journalist this long, I am alarmed at what I see increasingly more and more people, whether they're journalists or regular citizens. Not that journalists aren't regular
gonna say there's-
citizens,
well,
but
that's
you know,
quite a distinction
journalists, citizens and citizens who become journalists, who should know better, or actually have the time rather to explore, is a better way to put it, are more and more content to take a press release, to take a handout,
Yep.
to take the word of authority, and just repeat it. And to not talk about things if someone in authority tells us not to not say things if someone in authority tells us not to say them. So this just goes against my grain.
Right.
So very often this puts me at odds with the pack,
Right.
which I'm very happy to be. I actually don't like covering stories once a lot of people are on them. I like being ahead.
Okay.
And even though at a certain point, very often I've noticed that, you know, it may be that someone else ends up really leading at a certain point or being recognized for leading on a story. But I know to myself that actually I noticed that a year ago. And I might have written, but it was too new. So
Okay.
I kind of like going where most people are not.
Right.
And I just am comfortable there and looking around. And I also just find that it more an interesting exercise. So that's how I ended up really carving out my own niche as a journalist.
Okay.
I write my column every week for Universal UClick, and it's in about over 100 papers across the country. And I just choose to write. I'm also I'm a mother and a wife, and so I found early in my career that I had to be really interested in something to get it done in the number of hours I can give to it. If I'm bored, it won't be done on time. I have to like what I'm writing. So this early on kind of made it easy to choose what to do. Whatever I was on fire about, I would write. And then I'd be done, I could go pick up the kids at school or what have you.
So what was your first job?
My first job out of school, I left college, and my very first article was actually a magazine, an article from Cleveland Magazine.
Okay.
And I wrote a feature story about an old Cleveland, forgotten early financier in Cleveland that no one knew about anymore, but there was a building in his name, I believe the Kirby Building. And no one really knew what it was, who he was, how he'd been. Turned out he developed quite a lot of Cleveland, and I was in the, you know, the newspaper morgues and the back issues and stuff. I loved doing that. That was my very first. And then I got a job in New York City working for the Public Interest, which was a scholarly journal, 4-time a year journal published by the late Irving Kristol.
Okay.
And I was an assistant editor, but really an intern. And I just learned editing there, and went to get lunch and made coffee and did those things. And then my first real job, really, well, that was a real job, but my first job where I was not an intern was at the Washington Times, and I joined that as a reporter. And I have been a movie critic and a presidential campaign feature writer and an editorial writer, general feature writer and magazine writer. And at a certain point after I had children, I realized I needed to do more commentary because I could do it in funny hours, and I enjoyed it.
Yep.
And then I got into essay writing, and then eventually got a column about, in 1999 I started my column, and it's been weekly ever since. And I wrote my first book, Death of the Grown-Up, for St. Martin's Press in 2007.
Right.
And American Betrayals also with St. Martin's Press, and that just came out this summer.
So if we had an aspiring college student who had the idea of becoming a journalist, what advice would you give?
Don't.
Don't do it because it's so difficult to break in.
It's difficult to break in, and unfortunately, I mean, one of there are many plus sides to the internet age, and you know, the ease of reaching people and the ease of of finding wonderful archives. I mean, I could not have done this work as easily without the internet, because I found certain archives, for example, the State Department records. I found, instead of having to go every time to the Library of Congress or to the State Department reading room or something, I could go online and find all of the State Department records searchable through University of Indiana, I believe it is.
Oh, okay.
Might
And
be
is
Illinois.
Is it free to anyone?
It's free to anyone, and that's the kind of thing that's
so
wonderful.
That's a tip that the audience.
That's a tip.
There you go.
Absolutely.
Wonderful.
That kind of thing is fantastic. On the other hand, it has cheapened the printed word. And so much of what you read, of course, is for free. And it's harder to make ends meet, I think, as a journalist. Magazines used to pay quite well if you were lucky enough to break into,
Right.
glossy journalism. Used to pay quite well. Does not pay, well, there aren't as many anymore, and they have to compete. So anyway, it's not a growth industry at the moment, until
Right.
maybe there's some new incarnation. But on the other hand, there's nothing wrong with developing your skills and blogging and reporting and doing it. But it probably, if I were giving advice to my own daughters, I would say something else on the side as well, because you need to make a living. And I think it's harder. I think it's harder for young people to start and get a job in journalism now.
Okay. One thing that's very important to any journalist is how they frame issues.
Yeah.
And one of the frames that you used was the whitewashing of Islamic jihadism.
Yeah.
What kind of resistance have you had relating to that kind of a frame? When you push that frame out there, I'm aware of at least one person who sort of took you to task, if you would, in their view. I think the person's name was Ron Radush.
Yes. Oh, but that wasn't about Islamic Jihad. That was about this new book, American Betrayal. And essentially, I've actually been working on a very long rebuttal to this very long review that he wrote at Front Page Magazine that actually kicked off, oh gosh, about a dozen copycat pieces. I say copycat because they were not written by people who had read the book. And some of them actually admitted they had not read the book, but they were simply drawing on his research, which, as I will be soon unveiling, I hope in the week after Labor Day, a very lengthy rebuttal to his very lengthy review. I think it was 7,000 words, the original review.
And I would term it somewhat catabolic in the sense of
yes.
You can do a review.
It's an ad hominem review.
Yeah, you can do a review that that shows differences of opinion,
Yes.
but without being sort of catabolic, meaning a little bit more destructive than you need to be.
Well,
so I thought it was my impression reading it.
Depends what you're trying to do. And what I welcome debate. I hope I didn't just make too much noise.
Yeah.
I welcome debate. I love debate. And I actually have been looking forward to debate and have had very interesting conversations about the book already. But this actually was not, in my view, having analyzed this piece and about to come out with my rebuttal, which will be at least, I can advertise it at least at my website, dianawest.net, if people want to follow up on this, I hope next week. This review essentially was a review from the point of view of the established narrative, meaning the narrative we all know or remember from high school history, or if we've studied in college, or what we've picked up along the way in terms of a very triumphal World War II period, a very concerted Cold War effort, and the presidents leading the way there would be Franklin Roosevelt in World War II. He's got an enormous memorial in Washington, D.C. that I think partly because of his war leadership, although it mostly mentions, actually it's almost all about the Depression leadership, the actual memorial, but we think of him as one of our greatest presidents, and then we have Harry Truman, whose reputation is of a great cold warrior, and so on. And when we think forward from that, we have what's known as the Red Scare, which is when congressional investigators, including not only Joseph McCarthy, but certainly most remembered as Senator Joseph McCarthy, looked for Reds under the bed in the Red Scare, which was supposed to be an imaginary period. So this is kind of what we know and what we still learn. And I think the review in many ways is protecting that narrative and is very determined that my book, which has actually had quite a very overwhelming reaction with readers. I mean, I'm very proud of the reaction I've had from readers and many of my reviews. My book actually messes with the narrative. My book does something. It's actually a very basic mechanism, and I've been thinking a lot about it. It's funny when you are overwhelmed with, I have 900 plus endnotes in this book. The research that went into this book was intensive. The review that you're referring to makes it sound like there's no research. It does not admit any research and does not discuss any research. It makes it sound like, in fact, it calls my book Yellow Journalism and conspiracy theories.
Well, that's what I kind of meant about catabolic,
Yes.
as opposed to saying that I don't agree with this, but
Right.
here's why.
But here's why. No, but you see, the thing
But
is,
there were some characterizations
Yes.
that I think stepped a little bit over the line.
well,
So
a
that's
lot,
why
I would say.
That's
Yeah.
why I was curious about that.
Well, the reason that I think it was more about not debating with me is that if you have a book with 900 plus endnotes and you write a 7,000 word review and you don't reveal that these findings may be disturbing or shocking or wrong, however, the sources are there and I don't agree with the interpretation, or there's
Right.
another thing to consider or something like
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
If you actually, in a sense, in the effect, hide the fact that this is about the most densely researched history book anyone will pick up, even though it's a first-person narrative and not a conventional history, I think something else is going on. And I think, again, it's this notion of protecting the narrative that I disturb. Let me give you an example. The mechanism by which this is different, and it's actually different from almost any book you will pick up. If you have any books on your shelf, or if you go to the local bookstore and pick up books that are brand new, you will find, actually, do it as a test, because it's kind of a fun exercise.
Okay.
If you pick up the latest Eisenhower biography or history of the Cold War or World War II military book, chances are, I can't say never, never, because of course there's always exceptions, but chances are you will not find research material that includes the Soviet KGB cables known as the Venona archives, which talk about what the American traders were actually doing during World War II. It's a very specific period. Or declassified FBI files that talk about the same period and after and so on. Or congressional investigations that actually looked into some of these things and were able to come up with some concerted, some official findings. For example, did you know that the American government under Roosevelt gave Stalin uranium and heavy water and something like 23 atomic materials during the hush-hush period of the Manhattan Project?
Right.
That's something most Americans don't know. This is the kind of thing that congressional investigations discovered in 1950, but it kind of disappeared from our history, and that became like, well, why? Where did that go? Why is that not part of our story?
The lexicon, for instance, a elementary school teacher
Not going to know that.
would not know that or share that. And
Or high school.
Let me ask you, based on if a elementary school teacher, because they teach a lot of history, obviously, say grades 3 to 6, let's say, were to read your book, how would you suggest they change a narrative that they might give, and do you think it would endanger their job, for instance?
Oh, well, I suppose, I don't know. I don't remember learning very much about history from grades 3 to 6. I would prefer that this kind of research be introduced at a high school level or college.
At a high school level, let me ask the same question.
Yeah, at a high school, because that's where I remember I learned U.S. history. I remember writing on my notebook U.S. history.
8th grade, maybe?
Well, I remember. I think there was probably. No, I don't know if I did it in 8th grade. I think I was from California. I think we did California history in 8th grade. We did a lot of California history in California. But I remember 11th grade, where you really get a very serious treatment of U.S. history from the beginning to as close to the end as the teacher can get before the end of school. And I think that at that level, and certainly once you get to college, is where this information becomes more important. A teacher losing their job, there's nothing to lose your job over in this, because this is fact-based narrative. I mean, this is, if you're teaching about Soviet infiltration, I think it does belong in a course that takes in the middle part of the 20th century. So obviously it's not about the 19th century or the country's founding, but once you come into the Roosevelt years and the war years and the Cold War years, yes, you must start, I believe, you must start to give people the whole picture. And what I was going to say, for example, if you pick up a book by the very celebrated Yale professor John Lewis Gaddis, I just was looking at this because this was one of the books held up as the word in this review. We were talking about why I'm wrong, wrong, not just different or having another opinion. I am wrong because this book says X. Well, This particular book, there's a book called The Cold War, A New History by Professor Gaddis from Yale. I'm actually a Yale alumna. That book does not use the same sources I do. It does not get into the Soviet infiltration of our government in the 1930s and 40s and 50s, or the investigations certainly by then, and does not include that as matter fit to study when you're looking at an overview of the Cold War. How can that be? Alger Hiss does not figure in that book. A very famous spy, worked at the State Department, had much to do with the agenda at Yalta, was able to shape things in Soviet favor at Yalta, and then, of course, oversaw the foundation of the United Nations. We never think about that a Soviet agent, straight up, no question about it, worked for military intelligence, decorated by Soviet Union, straight up spy, Alger Hiss, actually presided over the foundation of the United Nations. Another Soviet agent, Harry Dexter White, very high up at the Treasury Department at this period, presided over the founding of the IMF and the World Bank. We never think about that, but those are the mechanisms by which we have international relations today. Isn't that interesting that we don't connect? I mean, this is just fact. So if a teacher were to introduce that, I think it starts giving people a more holistic, if that's the right word, view of history rather than just sort of the pageantry of, yes, we won the war and defeated Nazism and so on and triumph in the Cold War. I mean, frankly, I think it's a lot of fairy tales at a certain point if you're not also showing, you know, what's behind the curtain. Because that's where this intelligence war was being waged against us by the Soviet Union the whole time. And that, to me, should not be separate from our story. And that is what destroys the current narrative. It makes it a darker story. It's not a feel-good story. Although, I will say, I have heroes in this book that people will be inspired by, and I was, and we don't know their names. And that, to me, is sort of the good part of the book. It's sort of the inspirational core, because there were truth tellers along the way who were trying to bear witness or investigate, and, you know, they were very often smeared and isolated and suffered great personal cost for doing this. And those kind of people, to me, are just the best. But their story needs to feed into our story. And this is really why it's called American Betrayal. I feel like we, the people, were betrayed, and continue to be so long as we don't actually start reckoning with this past. I mean, I know people say, oh, that's ancient history. Well, it is and it isn't. I mean, it affects us to this day, and again, I think there are aspects of it we're actually experiencing today. If I'm looking back in the past and looking at influence, it's not that, I think one thing, we're all conditioned, you know, because we watch great and fun movies on spying and espionage and thrillers, and we read them, and it's always about stealing a secret, or getting the secret formula through, or finding out the battle date ahead of time and that kind of thing. That's only one part of espionage. The more dangerous part, and what fascinates me, influence, deception, disinformation. The Soviet Union was brilliant at practicing these things. It's gray, it's shadowy. How does it work? Can it just be a smile? Can it just be inviting a certain person into the policy circle? Can it be keeping a person out? Can it be protecting someone from a security investigation if they're under suspicion? Can it be just promoting a certain narrative? For example, Harry Dexter White, I mentioned a moment ago, this is a fact, this is not speculation. We have found out since the Soviet Union fell. He was actually, this is a little bit of both, because he met with a Soviet handler across the street from the Treasury Department at the Old Ebbitt Grill in Washington. He was given language that the Soviets conceived of for bringing America and Japan to war. He took that language, he memorized it. I don't think the handler gave it to him. He said, don't take the piece of paper, just remember it. And he goes back, and eventually he's able to get it into the cable flow, because he was very close to the top of the government, between America and Japan. And indeed, that language from Russia became what the Japanese considered our ultimatum cable. And after that, we had Pearl Harbor. Influence. I mean, it's an amazing thing. That's a very striking, concrete, much more concrete than a lot of times it is. A lot of times it would just be favoring a certain policy as the best, while the person in power thinks you're acting in American interests when really you have Russian interests at heart. And there's a very interesting figure I look at a lot in the book, Harry Hopkins, who was Roosevelt's top aide. He lived in the White House for 3.5 years. And General Marshall, who later became Secretary of State Marshall, he worked on an equal level with Hopkins during the war. He was Army Chief of Staff under Roosevelt. He actually said to his official biographer, I found this in the, again, another great internet find. George Marshall's papers are available. Anyone can read them for free. You can read the transcripts of his interviews with his biographer, Forrest Polk, and I did. And I found this amazing quotation that's in my book. Again, just sitting at home reading the internet, reading official transcripts. Marshall in 1957, when he was talking about Hopkins during World War II, said to his biographer, Harry Hopkins had the Russian interest for the president. I had the American interest. Well, what does that mean? I mean, can you imagine the president's top advisor having the Russian interest, representing the Russian interest? Well, this is the sort of thing that raises questions about Hopkins. Another thing would raise question about him is that one of the great Soviet illegals who worked here, he pretended, an illegal, of course, is the kind of spy from the Soviet Union who is not connected officially to the embassy. In other words, he's not a diplomat, he doesn't have protection. If something goes wrong, they don't know who he is. And we had this just recently, remember a couple years ago, the 10 illegals, I think it was, who were sent back to Russia before we really could even talk to them.
They were in court here in Boston.
Yes, and that was an influence operation when you look at what they were, the way I remember the news reports, there was fear by our security agencies that one of them was about to get too close to Hillary Clinton. What was she going to do? Steal secrets from her bag? Well, most likely, maybe that, but maybe she would be influencing her or something else. So that's how influence works. You get close to a person in power and you shape you give them input. I mean, it's as simple as that. It's like what we're doing now, really, except, I'm not working for the Soviet Union. But the point is that Hopkins was described by what the Soviets considered their greatest illegal spy master, a man named Akhmarov, during the war years. He actually pretended to be a Baltimore furrier. I mean, can you imagine? But he was actually running all these spies in Washington. But he lectured the KGB junior people in, I think it was the 1960s. And he told them that Harry Hopkins was the greatest agent they had.
Interesting.
This came out to us through one of the men in the audience, a KGB officer named Gordievsky, who later became a double and actually worked for British intelligence in Moscow, I believe, for the British, pretending to be a KGB colonel for something like a decade. He's considered a very reliable source. And he came out and related this in his book about the KGB in 1990. And what fascinated me about that was there was very little further study. Like, why wouldn't everybody just start studying Harry Hopkins? It didn't really happen. So that was kind of where I went with this. I wanted to see if I could assemble my own dossier on Hopkins, among other people in the book, and just track, are we looking at influence operations in his ballpark, as well as the ones we know about, which is something else I go into as well.
One of the things that sort of strikes me is that to some extent we're perceiving ourselves in this conversation as a nation, as a victim. I'm wondering, is it not possible that we were also spying and doing similar things in the Soviet Union?
No.
How so?
No, I'm serious. That we did not have any. I actually go into that in the book. No, we did not have anything similar on the ground.
At the time, you believe?
Oh no, it's true. We did not have anything like that underway. We were not operating in those terms. We were not nearly as sophisticated. I mean, we didn't have, well, we started with the OSS, which is the precursor to the CIA. During World War II, we didn't have this kind of spy bureaucracy that the Soviet Union began to build as soon as it came into power. They were way ahead of us. Their first main adversary was actually Britain. We were not as important to them initially. We became more important over time. But they actually pioneered penetration. And I don't think, I'm not an expert in future, or not future, but in operations following this period in the 70s or 80s or something. I mean, we do know that we have definitely had moles and so on. We definitely have attempted to penetrate networks. But it'd be interesting to ask a real expert and say, did we ever get on the same level of success? And I can't answer that, but I know at the time, we did not have anything on the ground. They had networks here that were, for example, there's a very interesting case that I go into with a man named Viktor Kravchenko, who was in Washington working as a Soviet official for the Lend-Lease agency, the Soviet side of it. Lend-Lease was a supply program to our allies, and the Soviets got tons of stuff.
This is during the war?
During the war. And Kravchenko worked in Washington, right up from the White House. I pass where the building was and look at it all the time. And he defected. He was one of the first really important defectors, one of the very first. He defected and went to the FBI at a certain point and wrote a very famous book, a couple of very famous books. The most famous is I Chose Freedom, and it's a wonderful book I recommend to everyone to read if they're interested, about his life and his defection and all of this interesting stuff, and he's a very good writer. Anyway, he was hunted by the Soviets. And he was also kind of working with our FBI, but they had a network. The point is, they had a network here that actually penetrated his sort of household that he developed with some expatriates, ex-Soviets and so on, trying to help him, writers who were trying to get his story out and work with him on his book and things like that. One of the Soviet agents that got into him actually worked for him, I believe, as a secretary. She was actually reporting back the whole time. And when I was writing about this episode, I actually make the point, we actually did not have something like that in the Soviet Union at this time. We didn't have Russian speakers masquerading there or people who could pretend to be furriers and you know what I mean? We're a nation of immigrants. They're not. I mean, the cover situation wasn't there, but also the sophistication wasn't there. And the other thing what wasn't there, and this is a very important point, we did not consider them, our government anyway, the people at the top did not consider the Soviet Union to be our enemy. We were in an alliance. The Soviet Union, however, always considered us and Britain to be their enemy, even during this period of alliance. And they were constantly preparing for something later after the war. And in fact, Kravchenko talks about this, that while he was working in Washington, they were basically instructed to be preparing for the hostilities ahead. So I think that's another unconventional reading of the past. We assume there were three big, in Europe, I'm not talking about the Pacific War with China, but three big allies in Europe against Hitler: Stalin, Roosevelt, Churchill. And yet when I look back at it and try to reconcile this, I realize there was Stalin and Churchill, but there was Roosevelt and Churchill, but Stalin was always working not to destroy Hitler, but to supplant him, to take his place, and he did.
They did have a treaty as well.
Yes,
initially.
initially.
Part of the engineering to do that, right?
Well, that was how the war started, which people sometimes forget. The 1939 Friendship Pact between the Nazis and the Soviets, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, that actually had a secret plan to divide up Europe between them. And the scary thing is, and I actually read this in another book before I wrote mine that I think may have gotten me thinking about my book. It's a book by a man named Gregor Dallas called 1945, The War That Never Ended. It's very interesting, very long book, but I found it very interesting. And he points out that, others may have, but this is where I first read it, that at the end of the war, the Nazi-Soviet pact was actually fulfilled without the Nazis. In other words, Europe had been carved up with the Soviet Union getting everything that they would have gotten had they had the pact with the Nazis, only the Nazis, of course, were destroyed.
Right.
So in other words, they got what they wanted.
Right.
And the interesting thing about that pact, that secret part, the secret protocol they called it, we almost didn't find out about that. And I write about this in the book. It was an amazing thing. During the Nuremberg trials, which were the trials of Nazi war criminals after the war, a German lawyer who was meeting with some of the Nazi clients he had, was in the prison yard, and he actually heard a couple of the top Nazis talking about the secret pact, and no one knew about it in the public eye, and he was able to find it in Nuremberg, and he was not able to introduce it as evidence in the trial. However, and this was a real moment for the press, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch published it, and I don't know, I'd love to know how it got from, I don't know the story, but this could not be hidden once it was published. And this is one of my big themes: publish, openness, transparency, no more secrecy. I mean, I am hugely upset about how much is in our archives that remains secret to us, even from this period, which should be open at this point. There is no reason not to open up our archives at this point. But that was one, I do believe, had this not gotten right to the press, we might not have found out about that until later.
So let me ask you, does this, in your view, does this have a systemic quality to it in terms of what we're seeing in the current administration, and not necessarily to pin this current administration, but
All of
the
them.
bureaucratic,
Yes,
the
yes.
sort of the bureaucratic ways
Yeah.
of the system.
Absolutely. I think that's very true.
What's going on in the culture, let's say,
Yeah.
of bureaucracy
Culture of power.
that allows this to
Yeah.
happen? Are there some points that you'd make on that?
Absolutely, and it is certainly not unique to this administration by far. It continues to accelerate with each administration. Transparency is really a thing of the past, which is you cannot have a democratic republic without transparency. You cannot function as citizens with an interest and a responsibility to run things. I mean, we are the people who are supposed to have the power. This I do again put down to a lot of these trends began under FDR, who was able to seize power because of the Depression and the war in ways that were unprecedented. I believe unconstitutional, and I don't think that's just I'm not a constitutional lawyer, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a constitutional scholar, and it's not unique to me to note this. This is something that a number of people with more expertise have noticed in terms of what he did in his presidency. One thing he did was essentially take over treaty making in the sense of, again, that program Lend-Lease, which allowed him to, at his own discretion, decide any country in the world could get unlimited aid if the president so ordained without asking for
Permission from Congress or something?
And I think Congress, Senate, has consistently lost power, maybe with a few blips across the ways, but has almost consistently lost its sense of its powers, almost following from there. The State Department, too, was marginalized in the Roosevelt years, interestingly enough. Secretary of State Cordell Hull, who was Secretary of State during most of the war years, didn't go to a single of those famous wartime conferences, with Churchill and Stalin and Roosevelt and Chiang Kai-shek. He didn't go. Harry Hopkins went, and he actually functioned as foreign minister. He worked on a par with the foreign secretary or foreign minister of the Soviet Union and Britain, respectively, which is another interesting thing about his power. But yes, the secrecy, but it's gotten so much worse that when Roosevelt came back from the Yalta Conference, which was the last conference Roosevelt had, people talk about the betrayal at Yalta because many of the things decided there put people under communism for those next 4 decades and turned over slave labor to the Soviets out of Germany and turned over millions of people who did not want to go back to the Soviet Union. This is another real crime we participated in that we don't know much about as a people, repatriation. It's called Operation Keelhaul. But after Yalta, when Roosevelt came back, he reported to Congress. And the people were outraged because they felt like maybe he wasn't telling them everything. And he didn't. And indeed, we didn't find out everything about Yalta until years later. But when you think about the mindset, we don't expect our leaders to come home from meeting other officials and tell us anything. I don't think. I don't have the same sense that we expect our presidents or secretaries of state to tell us what they talked about. I think we've given them all manner of secret powers, and we expect them to keep secrets from us. And I think that's, again, a very dangerous trend. And I think that when you go back and see the sort of concern that Roosevelt may not have told us one thing or two things, I go through it in the book, I can't remember all the details, but there was just this notion that, oh my gosh, he really made a mistake because he didn't come clean on what was going on there. Do we expect a president to come home and tell us everything he talked about with a leader? I don't think so.
Well, let me ask you this about journalism, though. It seems to me that journalism is weak on this count
Absolutely.
as well. And
laughable.
My favorite example is smoking is a habit.
Yeah.
Right? It's not considered a clean habit even.
Right.
Some people, smokers, might even be offended by me saying that. Having said that, the journalistic world did not report on Obama's smoking during the election.
Right.
And I thought, wow, why did they not? Why did not that part of a person's character? I'm not sure it's a part of their character, but it's a part of their habits.
Sure.
And it just doesn't jive to me that a sort of open journalistic view wouldn't have picked up on it and sort of let it be out to the public. And I'm not against Obama. I'm more looking at journalism and saying, what's going on with, why wasn't that more widely reported?
Yeah, well, we could do a whole show on what the journalists did not report about Obama. I mean, that's a fairly well-known tale. At least if you look into it a little bit, it's easy to find out. But it's more journalism, especially White House journalism, has become more and more almost court reporting, not justice court reporting, but monarchical court reporting, taking handouts. Letting silly questions be their daily work. There are exceptions, of course, but not enough and not consistently enough. I mean, they are supposed to be our eyes and ears.
The reprisals are kind of difficult, though, for them.
This is a terrible thing.
Line,
You're right.
It seems to me that here in New England, it's the Belichick kind of era.
Yeah.
And there's a sense that he doesn't like getting asked tough questions. So that there are reprisals that you don't really know about. So
there are ways to take care of that.
I don't want to compare the president and Belichick, but there's a sense that you can affect transparency by the things that you do.
Well, they allow it because they have more power than that. Again, I think of Congress the same way. I think of the press the same way, like Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz. Click your heels together 3 times. You have so much power you can't even imagine. They don't have to take this.
Okay, let me interrupt you now.
Sure.
We only have a couple of minutes
okay.
left. I want you to have an opportunity.
Only a couple of minutes
That's
left.
it. We went right through. But I want you to have an opportunity to say, here's 3 things that I want the audience to come away with, either about your book, and give yourself some credit. Anyone who writes a book deserves credit.
Thank you.
Even if I didn't agree with some of the things you've said, that's okay. So go ahead. You just have a couple of minutes.
Okay.
How do you want to end the show that would benefit you or the audience or however?
Well, that's very kind. First of all, I'd like to thank you for this opportunity to speak to your audience. I'm a Washingtonian, and I'm glad to be in the Boston area.
Okay.
About what I hope people take away from the book, I hope people will become curious and would like to judge for themselves what all the fuss is about with this book. It has become quite controversial, and my editor, my publisher, my publicist, all my friends, they're thrilled, because when you become controversial, you at least get attention, and so that, to me, becomes the opportunity to interest readers to pick up the book. It is a long book, it has a lot of footnotes, but I think it's a very accessible book because, again, I choose to take the reader by the hand to present these shocking pieces of history and put them together with the reader, because that is exactly what I did in writing the book. And so what I ended up doing was really recreating my own process, because if I'd started at the end, no one would have believed me. So I actually go step by step by step.
All right. Well, my guest today has been Diana West. Here's her book, American Betrayal. It gives, I think, a reader the opportunity to question history, to question your beliefs, and to take a new look at perhaps what's happening today with everything from the Islam movement and journalism and history of World War and things like that. So I want to thank Diana for making this very controversial book, as it turns out, come to life. I think it's a good read, and I would recommend that you take some opportunity to do that. So this has been International Forum here at Stoughton Media Access Cable. Thank you for watching.
This is Roy Cohen, producer and director of the International Forum show. Thank you for watching, and we welcome your comments to our email address, international.forum@yahoo.com. Good evening.